Good afternoon. I'm Don Norman from the Design Lab. This afternoon's speaker is interesting. Lots of people like to start companies. And when you start a company, you worry a lot about, the product and, can I get the right people to understand the technology and to build it, and how much will it cost, and what's the market and all that. One of the last things a company ever thinks about is the name. And name, how hard can that be? Well, let me tell you, it's really hard. And I can tell you about my own company. So here's a simple story. My son, Eric, graduates from Rady Business School with his nice new MBA and says, I worked for Toyota for 7 years in Japan, and I never want to work for a large company again. I'm going to start my own company. And so he's going to make a cooking product that cooks steaks perfectly, or fish, or vegetables, or whatever. I won't go into a sales pitch about the company, but name, never thought about it. But suddenly, we have to incorporate in order that people can invest, and we have to have a name. What should it be? And so big mad dash to think of names, and finally, this is going to be an autonomous cooker that cooks by itself. We'll name it autonomous. Oh, well, that's taken. Well, autonomy, no, that's taken. And so ended up with autonomy spelled AUTONOM3. Autonomy with a 3 in it. Very nerdish. Not a very good name for a company. And so a year or two later, as the product was starting to get formed, it's time to have a real name. And so what should that real name be? And any name you could think of, somebody already owns. And actually, you can often buy the name if you have a couple $1,000, but startups don't have a couple $1,000. So it ended up being Pallet Home. The home had to be there because Pallet was taken by another 10 or 15 companies. Pallet Home, does that inspire you to buy something? And then one day, Eric wrote me an email and said, the new name of the company is Cinder. I said, what? Cinder? A cooking thing? Where did that name come from? Oh, it came from this great guy I discovered called Anthony Shore, who worked with us. And I did some research on Anthony. Actually, the New York Times helped me a lot by doing a lot of research and telling me about him. And naming names is really hard. And I discovered some of the products I owned, like the Lytra camera, had been named by Anthony. And Cinder? Well, people worry about Cinder for a cooking product, and I'm sure you'll tell us more about it, but I've come to like it. I tell people, hey, I cindered a steak yesterday. Or, I'm cindering all evening because I'm having guests coming over. Turns out it's a really neat name, and it works. And actually, if you go and look at the tweets, and you look at the product isn't released yet, but the name seems to work. Now, what do you have to do to make a name work? It's not easy. There's a lot of linguistics involved. There's a lot of psychology involved. And there's a lot of copyright law involved. It's really hard. And that's why we asked Anthony to come down here and tell us about it, because he tells a fascinating story. Anthony?
Thanks, Don. Excuse me. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what I do. These are some of the things that I've named. I've been lucky enough to name over 160 companies and products over 25 years. I'm a linguist by training from UC Santa Cruz. Go Slugs. And I've spent, of my 25 years professionally, spent about 13 years at a company called Landor Associates that's best known for branding. I was global director of naming and writing at Landor, also worked for a spell at Lexicon Branding, cool little boutique naming shop. But now I have my own shop called Operative Words, and I name things or do anything that's 6 words or fewer. I tend to tap out after that many words. Now, I name things, and I'm really passionate about it because names, brand names, are an inescapable part of our environment. And I know that I'd rather be surrounded by awesome words, wonderful words, imaginative words, creative words, emotional words, than verbal blight, right? Wouldn't you? I mean, I hate ugly words. So just like an architect would rather design beautiful buildings or gardens to surround their environment, I want to have words that are like that, like beautiful buildings or beautiful gardens. And luckily for my clients, those kinds of names, those names that are creative or have depth and dimension, those are the names that appeal to consumers as well as to other businesses. So it's a win-win all around. Now, many of you are creators of one kind or another. And as a creator, it's your prerogative to name the baby. You want to name the things that you create. It's our instinct. And after all, you have to refer to something using some kind of a name. So someone's got to do it, right? You want to name the baby. Now, because I want to surround the world with great names, it's my job to help everyone be a great namer or at least a great judge of names. So I give away all of my expertise, tips, tools, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to be talking to you today about some of those things so that when we're all said and done, when a naming project falls in your lap, you'll have a better idea of what to do so that you can end up with a great name at the end of the day. Now, naming babies is a little different from naming products, okay? So, baby name is pretty straightforward. You and your partner come up with a name, you like it, you can anoint the baby with that name, and you're done. Baby adopts your last name. Now, trademarks, product names are a little bit different. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the anatomy of a product name. There's typically two parts to an innovation name. First is the brand name, and the next is a product descriptor. Okay, and I'll talk about those individually. So you're probably familiar with Nest. Their first product was the Learning Thermostat. Okay, Nest here is the brand name, and Learning Thermostat is the product descriptor. And there's never been a Learning Thermostat before Nest's Learning Thermostat. All right, so they did something really creative by creating a novel descriptor that told you a little bit more about the product than just saying it's a thermostat. Don mentioned the Lytro, which is a newfangled camera that's unlike any other camera. Most cameras record points of light, pixels, on a sensor. The Lytro records light rays. So instead of measuring resolution in megapixels, it measures in mega rays. And this enables you to do things with a Lytro picture that you can't do with other kinds of pictures. So you don't focus a Lytro. What you do is you focus pictures after you have taken them, and you can adjust the focus of an image after you have taken the picture. Now, let's take a look at this name here, the two parts. Lytro is the brand name. Light Field Camera is the product descriptor. So they do different things, and they feel very differently as words. So a brand name, you want to be proprietary. You want to own it, because as a brand name, it's an indicator of your product or your goods and services. So you don't want it to be confused with anything else. That's an advantage for you, but that also makes it difficult because you run into trademark issues, as Don had mentioned earlier with some of those other names that were considered by the company. A brand name should not be purely descriptive, and that's because purely descriptive names are not really ownable. The trademark office doesn't allow that, and for good reason. Brand names can look very different. Okay, so we have Nest, which is a real word, right? We've also got Apple, BlackBerry. These are all examples of what they call arbitrary names. You can also have a fanciful name like Lytro, which is just a made-up word, like Kodak, okay? But maybe you get a little bit more than just nothing from the name Lytro. You might hear the word light. You might have suggestions of nitro, something like that. But brand names are rarely obvious. It's been said that all the good names are taken, and that's wrong. It's only the obvious names that are taken. So it takes a lot of work to come up with a good brand name, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that when I go through some cases. A product descriptor, unlike a brand name, is going to indicate and define the product category or the product function or usage. It may be generic, it may be used by other companies, or it may be unique, right? Nest could have called their product a thermostat, just like Honeywell would, their competitor. But instead they called it a learning thermostat in order to set it apart as well as give an indication of how this product is different from any others. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the process. And it's pretty straightforward, actually. Excuse me. First, you have to understand what it is that you're naming. Okay, so what makes this product different from every other comparable product out there? You need to know the roadmap of your product, of your brand, because you need to know how big or how expansive the name needs to be. You know, we can look at a name like Radio Shack and see how that name might have made sense at one time, but it clearly became very outdated very long ago. You should also have an idea about the qualities or attributes of the brand, or what's going to appeal to the target audience and be relevant to them. And once you've gotten a good understanding of what needs to go into the name, you distill that down, or at least I do, into name objectives. These should be some succinct bullet points which capture the marching orders of the brand. What does this name need to accomplish? Now, good name objectives will inspire creative development. It will also serve as a filter for name selection and evaluation. Now, after you've done the objectives, the fun part begins, which is creative name development itself. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that. But what's important is that you spend enough time on creative development. Now, there's been a lot of research on techniques and processes for creative and what works. What I've found is very helpful is to immerse myself into a topic. Really just spend time focusing on it and creating names, and then putting it aside and forgetting about it, and then coming back a couple days later and going back in and creating more names around it and doing that repeatedly. That immersion followed by incubation, going back into immersion repeatedly, is how you can generate a massive amount of names. Incubation is really important for creativity. It's why people have those aha moments in the shower. It's because you've been thinking about something and then you stop thinking about it, but something's going on in the background that helps to put together solutions that you might not have come up with otherwise. Now, when I do creative development, I start off casting a very wide net. I want to look at different approaches, different perspectives, different styles of words. I like to think of it as a mile wide and an inch deep, because in a future wave of creative development, I'm going to focus much more, an inch wide and a mile deep, based on the kinds of names that we're working. So after a few weeks of creative development, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 names will have been developed, which seems ridiculous, right? But it's actually what you need to do to find great, creative, legally available names. There's a tall hurdle. After that, I select maybe 100 names out of those hundreds and run that through trademark screening. And that's because you don't want to set your heart and all your hopes and dreams on a name that you can't have. All right. It's very, it's disconcerting, and it's a setback when you become emotionally invested in a name that you can't have. Okay. So I want to avoid that and help clients avoid that by knocking out names that have obvious conflicts. So once names have gone through trademark screening, if 100 names go in, maybe 30 come back clear, maybe 50, those are the names that I would present to a client. And there's going to be names that they like, there's names they hate, names they're neutral about, and from that process learn about what really works. And it's at that point where a more focused round of creative development works, because you learn so much by the reactions from actual names, actual candidates, versus the abstract nature of what goes into those name objectives. Because it's very easy to agree in things in the abstract, but people have very different reactions once they see actual names on paper. So it's an iterative process, as you can see here. And then ultimately, it's up to the client to do full screening and registration, typically taking a couple of names into their screening, and then ultimately one of those will clear. So what I'd like to do now is talk about the process with a specific case history, and I'm going to give you 3 cases and talk about process and techniques and resources that I used on all 3 of these. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. So come closer, gather around. Last year, I was invited by a design agency named Character up in San Francisco, and I've done a lot of work with them, to help lead a naming project for a Silicon Valley startup. Now, this startup had 3 guys in it, all brilliant, all very successful and accomplished. And they were developing a radical form of entertainment. And the best way to describe this form of entertainment, this technology, is to tell you about my experience using a prototype of their technology. So I'm at their offices, and they're entrepreneurs in residence at a place called Red Point Ventures. And I go into this office, really bland, nondescript office. There were a lot of tchotchkes around, a couple of desks, but pretty nondescript. They put a chair next to one of the desks in a very specific place, and they say, sit down here. They then hand me a virtual reality headset, one called the Oculus Rift, which is not available for consumers yet. It's only in development, but probably next year, this virtual reality headset will go to market. So this headset is basically a screen that's strapped to your face, and it's right in front of your eyes, and you can't see anything except whatever is on that screen. So there I am sitting. Clients are in the room somewhere. And suddenly, what comes on the screen is the room that I'm in. Okay, so I'm sitting there. But now, my clients are over there, and over there. And they start throwing a Nerf ball around me. And I'm turning my head, again, with a head-mounted display strapped to my face, and I'm looking around, and I am following this ball as it's being thrown around me. But it's not really being thrown around me. It's a video that's playing. But I can look around the video in 3 dimensions. It was crazy. It was exactly like they were there in the room at that moment, but they weren't. Okay, so that's what this new brand needed to be, a form of cinematic virtual reality, the first one of its kind. Now, this Sputnik thing here with lenses is the original prototype of their camera. So this brand, this company, would make this crazy camera. It would make the technology that would stitch all of the video images together and display it in a way that was suitable for a VR headset. Plus, they had 3D audio technology so that when you turn your head, the sound tracks appropriately. So you could tell it was remarkable, and they had great ideas for what this would do. So this would be a new form of entertainment, and it would be the kind of thing where you could say, go sit on the 50-yard line of a football game and watch the game and look around. Or you could go to a concert and you could sit on stage and look around, and the artist would be there, but you could also check out the audience and so on. So a lot of incredible applications possible. So I was briefed on their vision, on what they wanted to do with this, and I developed these name objectives you see here. Now, I want to share the details of these projects with you so you could see what they look like and get a feeling for the kinds of information that's included in name objectives, but also what's left out. So good name objectives should be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. They should have everything you need to do naming, but nothing you don't. You don't want to get caught up in little details, especially because with technology, things change all the time. So this is really a brand that would be about incredible experiences in a new medium. It would be immersive, completely realistic. It would be a brand that should be capable of representing a whole new category of experience. The experience itself is transportive, right? So this idea of transporting people to another place. In fact, the client talked a lot about sci-fi and teleportation, that was an inspiration for them. And they liked the idea that something grounded in entertainment would have its roots in pop culture or perhaps in science fiction. The new name had to cover a lot of things. It had to cover the hardware, the software, app, and so on and so forth. So we can see that there's words that are in here, and each of these words can provide a toehold for creative development. And there's a lot of details that are left out. So transportive, immersive, experiential, and so on. Additionally, the name needed to work in the context the same way IMAX could, or Dolby, or Blu-ray, or 3D. Okay, so it has to work that way. They wanted something short and easy to spell, and they want to be able to own the name as well. So out of that, creative directions came up. These are specific areas that were explored during name development. So the whole idea of immersion. Now, I want to focus on this idea of transportive, okay? Now, when you think about something that's transportive, there's always change involved in that idea. So you go from one physical place to another physical place, right? That's literally transportive, right? But there's also a change in state that happens when you go from one place to another. There's a possibility that, okay, I want to see that Red Hot Chili Pepper show from a year ago, and so there's a change in time that happens. So when I think about naming and creative directions, I want to ladder up these ideas to a higher order, more abstract direction, because that's going to be much more generative, much more productive from a naming standpoint. If I only thought about transportive in terms of physical space, it'd be much more limiting. But any name that could get across the idea of change in its broadest sense could probably be relevant and differentiated in this context as well. And then we can see some other creative directions there. So where do I go to look for names? The first place I went to was the stupendous Glossary of Science Fiction Ideas, Technology, and Inventions website. There's over 2,300 separate entries that some kind-hearted person or people have painstakingly gone through science fiction, and it's actually a list and a definition of all these inventions from science fiction. So I plundered that. I literally went through all 2,300 entries to find words and ideas that might be relevant. There was a nice trove of ideas having to do with teleportation, and that was obviously relevant. I used a couple of other tools, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit as well. So the first tool is called Sketch Engine. Now, this is a corpus linguistic database. Corpus linguistics is when you analyze a giant body of text. And in this particular case, this is a 12 billion word corpus of actual English language that's been scraped from the web. And every word has been codified into a part of speech. And what this enables you to do is to look at relationships between words and to look at the behavior of words and to look for patterns as well. So if I plug fun into Sketch Engine, it's going to show me different things like who has fun. You can make fun of things, okay? So apparently hipsters, blondes, rednecks, all things that are made fun of. And this is what's actually recorded in how people use language on the web. So this enables you to find words related to concepts, but in a way that you will not find in any kind of thesaurus or anything else. So awesome tool. It requires a subscription, not a lot of money, and certainly well worth it if you need to come up with a name, because finding a good name can take time, and if you can speed up that process, it might be worth a little investment. Okay, next is onelook.com, an awesome free website. So this also looks at how words are used in context. And so if you put in fun, you can see all kinds of words in order to identify idioms or expressions or verbal phrases that include the word fun. So you can have a barrel of fun, there's a box of fun, or beef chow fun, whatever. Okay, moving on. We've got Rhyme Zone, which is not just rhymes, but also looks for words related to certain concepts. Again, very fruitful for creative development and finding unobvious names. Now, the rhyming part is really useful for a specific type of creative development technique. So I'll give you an example. There was a client I had who's a software developer and created some idea development and organization software. And this was originally for a device called the Palm Pilot, which most of you will not remember or know about, but some of you will. So in the creative development, I was thinking that the word brain would be really useful. I like that word. I wanted to do something with that in the name. So what I did was I looked for rhymes of the word brain. Okay, rain is one word that rhymes with brain, right? Then I do a lookup of rain in OneLook or other places, and I look for all the other words and expressions that include rain. And one of the words I found was rainforest. So now I have rainforest, but I changed that from rainforest to brainforest. And there you have a nice, fun, light name. And that was an actual product that was around for a while called Brainforest. So that's a really helpful technique for developing kind of witty, fun, playful names. Okay, the other tool I use for this current project, the entertainment project I've been talking about, is something called Moby Thesaurus. This is an open source list of words, and I've imported it into the Apple dictionary. So when I look up something on my Mac in the dictionary, it has its normal dictionary and thesaurus, but then it also gives me Moby Thesaurus results. And I want you to look at some of the interesting ideas that are generated when you type in fun. So you have fun, you have recreation, you have riot, you have howler. All right, these are things that a normal thesaurus will not come up with. Won't come up with. Okay, so creative development happens. I develop many hundreds of names for this project, and then comes time for trademark screening. So trademark screening looked like this for this particular entertainment technology client. Screening is necessarily a phased approach because when you're searching 100 names, it doesn't make sense to do a really detailed search. That can get very expensive. So a phased search is done where first U.S. federal and state trademarks are checked, then Google is checked, and anything that clears those moves on to an international search. Now, this is still far more thorough than a typical trademark screening would happen at the preliminary stage, but this also knocks out all those obvious names that the client cannot use. So after the screening, I'm able to look at a list of names and say, okay, this is going to be the presentation list. Now, let's talk about presentations. This is the template of the slide in which I presented names for this client. Now, what I actually did was I was thinking about this as an entertainment company. And what I want to do is I want to find a context for the name that will make it look like this name, this hypothetical name, is actually an existing brand. And not just a fledgling brand, but a really established one. Because when you make a name look like a fait accompli, when you make it look like it's already a brand, people suspend their disbelief. They are less likely to reject it and more likely to accept it. So I actually took a screenshot of Ticketmaster's page. I replaced some of the images here. I used Radiohead because they seemed cooler and hipper and more technological than whoever was there before. There's also all these different places where the name lives. So where it says Newco, down here, up there, and even down here, I would show this exact same slide, but replace the name throughout the presentation. We don't want to have confounding variables. We don't want to have different context for each name. We want to have the same context, and it needs to look like it's a real thing. So it's a little bit like if you say to someone, we're thinking of naming our child Harold versus meet Harold. Okay, you're going to get a very different reaction when you say, well, we're thinking about naming our kid Harold. You know, it invites criticism and it invites rejection. But instead, here's Harold. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reveal a couple of the backup names that the client did not select to show you a little bit what the depth or variety of creative can look like and how names are really different perspectives on a company and where they're going to be going. So the first name is Respace. Respace. So totally made up word, but it feels like a natural word. And it really emphasizes this idea of something that's transportive, something where there's a change in physical space that happens. Now, the client loved this name, but here's the problem with it. What we found in trademark screening, not my trademark screening, but in their trademark screening that there's a company called Red Space. And Red Space was in technology, and it was something a little bit similar, but obviously different from what my client was doing. So we had Respace, but then there's this Red Space out there. So it turns out that's a problem from a trademark standpoint. So this is the kind of hurdle we're dealing with in trying to develop a name that's not confusingly similar to another name. Okay, so goodbye Respace. Next name, Popover. So it's a fun name. It's a different name. It's whimsical. And yeah, Popover is a kind of muffin, sure. But in the context of virtual reality, it starts to feel more like a brand, which is fun, which is about just sort of popping over someplace. And so really getting that idea that you can quickly go from one place to another. So this is another name that the client was grooving on. The next name was Jaunt. Now, this is a name that came out of the exploration from the scientific glossary, science fiction glossary I told you about. Turns out there was a book written a long time ago by a guy named Alfred Bester called The Stars, My Destination. And in this science fiction book, this author, Bester, developed an idea called jaunting, which is not spelled like this, but it actually had an E on the end, and it was named after a person, not jaunt, as we know the word jaunt, and it was all about teleportation. So he talked about teleportation using the term jaunt. Later on, Stephen King wrote a short story called The Jaunt, and Stephen King referenced this Bester book, My Destination, the Stars, in Stephen King's short story. So there were already two pieces of pop culture, science fiction, where jaunt had been used to indicate teleportation. The client loved this name. And this is the actual launch image that happened with the name. This is a little cardboard virtual reality headset with their name on it. And here's a handsome bag they just gave me last week that has Jaunt on it. So they've been doing really cool things in creating content for this virtual reality experience. So up there on the left, you might recognize Sir Paul McCartney. That's him closing out Candlestick Park, which is now being demolished. And you can see the Jaunt camera right next to him. And he's singing Live and Let Die here. I was actually at the show. It's pretty awesome. And they've created an app for iOS where you can download Paul McCartney singing Live and Let Die. You put your phone in this box and you can look all around the stage and see Paul McCartney sing. So afterwards, if you guys want to see the demo, we can all check it out. Some other great content they've created, a short horror film called Black Mass, which was terrifying. I got a demo of all these things just a couple weeks ago where you're sitting there with your headset on and you're looking around and it's really scary stuff is happening all around you. Down there in the lower left is a World War II movie they filmed with New Line Cinema called The Mission, where it starts off and you parachute into a battle scene and there's fighting all around you and people are screaming. It's hectic. They've also partnered with North Face and have some amazing content of base jumpers where you're on the edge of the cliff and you can watch these base jumpers like fly off. It's insane. And then, of course, sporting things as well. So Jaunt is the name. Now, I glossed over their descriptor, Cinematic VR. I didn't create that; they did, but it's awesome and it's perfect. Now, the next case here, you've already gotten a little bit of a sneak peek in. Don's son Eric contacted me about naming this new thing that was at the time called Pallet Home, but they couldn't use the name, and maybe that's okay because maybe it's not a great name anyway. And they were calling it at the time Smart Grill. So that was the placeholder descriptor. And the idea with this device, it's really awesome, is that it cooks a super premium restaurant quality type food on your kitchen countertop. So there's a device called a sous vide that high-end restaurants use where you seal food in a bag and you put it in water and it heats the food up to a precise temperature and it cooks food very evenly and it takes a long time, but it makes perfectly cooked food. this is the same kind of idea, but it's more of a countertop griddle kind of idea, not cooking things in a bath. So what that enables you to do with this is you can sear meat. You can like press a button and it brings up to 550 degrees to sear it, or you can caramelize onions and so on. So super cool technology. And one of the things it does is that it uses satellite science, satellite algorithms used for navigating satellites in order to adjust temperature so that the temperature doesn't overshoot the mark. Because the same kind of care that you need to give when steering satellites, so a satellite doesn't like steer off and like, go out of orbit or plunge to Earth or anything like that, is the same kind of algorithm you can use to control temperature so that you don't overshoot the temperature. So the objectives that were developed for this were really around a brand that's experience focused, like around the yumminess of the food and not about a thing itself. But the name still had to work as a device name. Context for the name, let's throw a steak in the blank or on the blank, or it's easy to caramelize onions in the blank. Had to work with a variety of foods. And this is something that had to be comfortable as a device, kind of a workhorse in the kitchen, like a stove or an oven. Additionally, it's a whole new thing. There's nothing else like it. So the name had permission to break some rules and do something different. So the creative directions that I alighted on were looking at fire and heat generally, because it cooks things, right? So there's heat involved in that. There's also the science of cooking. That was an important dimension because there's a lot of science that went into this. But then there's the more hedonistic, enjoyable aspect, right, of the brand. So eating, dining, flavor, that kind of thing, nom, nom, nom. This cooks things perfectly, so perhaps perfection could be a direction as well as specific to how this thing works and heats food and uses, rocket science and so on. So, we've already unveiled the name, and this is the actual slide that I presented to Eric and his team with a prototype that you can see here. So the idea is to have yummy imagery, the product itself, and then some verbal context as well. And all of these different cues, again, help to suspend disbelief. Here's the actual product of what it's going to look like. Cinder is the name. This is another project I worked on with the design agency Character, and they developed that really elegant identity that you see there. Now, we know what to call it, but what is it? Okay. Earlier, we're using Smart Grill as a placeholder, okay? But maybe we can do something better than that. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about product descriptors, and specifically novel descriptors, because if you invent something that's never been invented before, what do you call it generically? Okay, so descriptors are really answers, and they answer what is it or what does it do? So at the minimum, a descriptor is going to indicate a product category, a function, a purpose, a use, and so on. So, grill, vacuum, camera, printer, all right? Pretty basic words, pretty basic ideas. But then there's ways to modify that basic descriptor. You can signal an audience, you can highlight an occasion for usage, or some other differentiating feature or attribute like Man Cave Natural Caffeine Shampoo. So I've never taken my caffeine topically, but apparently it's an option. Okay. So here's some different innovations, and let's take a look at the product descriptors that they use here. So the best practice for descriptors is that you use familiar words that people already know, but you combine them in novel ways. And that's kind of the essence of creativity, right? Is combining things in novel ways. So, would a rose by any other name smell as sweet? Or would an instant coffee by any other name taste as gross? Starbucks thought that they shouldn't call their instant coffee because when you hear instant coffee, if you're like most Starbucks customers, you probably wrinkle your nose and think, ew, gross. So they developed their own novel descriptor for their instant coffee, which is Ready Brew. And it makes sense. You kind of get this idea of something that's instant and also that it's coffee. A number of years ago, I worked with Dreyer's when they were developing a new kind of low-fat ice cream. Now, Dreyer's had this interesting process that they had developed where by mixing the ice cream in a certain way, they would take big fat globules in the ice cream and it would break them up into much smaller pieces. Okay? And the effect of this was that they could give low-fat ice cream a richness and a mouthfeel that's just like regular full-fat ice cream. So internally, they called it double extrusion technology. Yum, right? So, obviously they needed something different. So when I was at Landor, I led the project and developed the name Slow Churned as a way, kind of a novel descriptor for how to talk about this ice cream, right? So churned gets across something that feels a little bit more homemade, a little less manufactured. There's something a little old-timey about it, and the slow kind of amplifies that as well. So slow churned ice cream is done remarkably well for dryers. And on the right, some of you might recognize the old SNL skit with Chevy Chase for Lemon Shimmer, which is the world's first floor wax and dessert topping. And they adopted non-dairy floor wax as their novel descriptor, which I applaud. So if you are in a position where you're working on an innovation, you might find yourself having to come up with a name or a descriptor for a device that does the work of many devices, because that often happens in technology. Mobile phones started out with just being a telephone, these big Motorola bricks, right? Then they started bringing other things into it. So suddenly there's a camera that's in there. There's text messaging. And then eventually it evolved to a smartphone, which has a ton of different features, right? So when you're dealing with converged technologies, there's 5 different possible solution tracks that you can take for one thing that does many. So one approach is just to single out one function, and then you leave all the other functions sort of for copy and just talking about it in your messaging. So mobile phones before smartphones, they had cameras, but they didn't call it a mobile phone plus camera. They just called it a mobile phone. So that's one solution. You can highlight all functions in the descriptor. So an all-in-one printer fax scanner, which is really, really long, but also really clear. And there is a relationship between the length of a descriptor and its clarity. So you can have something that's perfectly clear and long, or perfectly short, and maybe you need to do some explaining somewhere else. You can also modify one function, such as calling it a phone, but it's a new kind of phone. It's a smartphone, okay? Additionally, you could also create a totally new descriptor. So I was lucky enough to work with an inventor named Steve Perlman, who's got a ton of patents to his name. And he was creating a whole new kind of DVR that did things that no other digital video recorder could do. It would do things like it would also enable you to put all of your movies and all of your music into one place. Now, we talked about what to call this. So the brand name is Moxie. I led the development of that, but Steve Perlman actually came up with that name. But I developed a descriptor for it, which is Media Center, and that was the first media center, and there were other media centers that came out afterwards. And it was novel at the time, but it was really kind of flattering that others took it up and it became a generic for a category. There are rare cases when some companies don't use any descriptor at all. So Apple is one of those companies, and when they came out with the iPod, they did not call it an MP3 player. They didn't want to ground it in a specific technology. They didn't want to sound like anything else out there. And most consumers didn't know what an MP3 player was, although there were many of them out there. So when Apple launched iPod, there was no descriptor. But what they did say is 1,000 songs in your pocket. And that's all you need to know. And because Apple had full control over the context in which the name appeared, they knew that they could telegraph the function of the product by means other than the name. Because it's not always the name's job to tell you everything about a product. And fortunately, the context that a company creates, the identity, the messaging, the imagery, the product design, all of those things also communicate things about a product and its usage. Now, if you want to learn more about descriptors, and I know you do, then go over to operativewords.com. I wrote a couple articles just about this topic. One is called Describe Different, and the other is called The Names of MIT Media Lab. because MIT Media Lab invents a lot of really cool things, and they do a really good job of naming them with novel descriptors. So let's go back to our smart grill, now called the Cinder. And what is the descriptor that was developed and how was it developed? So let's look at the base descriptors and the options that we have. And I'm showing you this to show you kind of the range of ideas that might be explored. So we could go ahead and we could just call it a grill or a griddle. It's probably the closest and most obvious thing we could do for the name. We could go ahead and call it an oven and redefine that, or maybe modify that. Like phone is modified to smartphone, we could call it a mini oven or a micro oven, okay? You can take an existing word like a hot plate and be cheeky with it, call it a haute plate, for haute cuisine. There's gastronomator, and I don't know what I was thinking there, but that didn't work. And that's okay, because when you name things, you don't know where the line is until after you cross it. So it's really important to have ideas that are brackets, that push it, that go to a place which is not appropriate or not good, because then you know where it is good, right? We could go ahead and own the word kiln in the kitchen. We could call it that. That didn't work either. But then let's look at how you could modify any of these. And I will literally take special software that's used for doing permutations, and I will take column A, which is this first box over here, and column B, and I will create permutations so that every possible solution is mapped out. And that's helpful for me because that way I can be forced to consider ideas that my brain might not have normally come up with. So software can be very helpful, just sort of doing that brute force combination. There were a handful of solutions that were seen as viable, and we alighted on the word cooker as the right base descriptor for this because it gave you an idea of what the function is without being too specific. And so the ultimate solution you can see here, the Cinder Sensing Cooker. And this is what actually appears on the website at cindercooks.com today. And the company name, by the way, is Cinder Cook Labs, also a novel descriptor developed for them. Okay, so check it out. Now, last thing, a medical innovation. This one just launched a couple months ago. So transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulators, or TENS systems, have been around for a while. And what this is a band that you wrap around your leg, and it sends electrical shocks to you, okay? It actually shocks you, very small shocks, it's adjustable. And it shocks specific nerves, and when those nerves are stimulated, it triggers our endogenous opioid system to relieve pain naturally. So we have natural painkillers in our body right now, all right? And if you stimulate the right nerves, that endogenous opioid system is triggered, and it provides systemic pain relief. So if you have fibromyalgia, if you have sciatica, osteoarthritis, other kinds of conditions, this kind of device will actually reduce your pain significantly. So it's for people with chronic pain. Now, this company had developed this device. It was FDA approved, and they were going to launch it. Now, Quell is the brand name that I developed for this device. So I'm not going to belabor the name. It's a nice name. I'm going to belabor the descriptors and focus on that. So let's take a look at the base descriptors here, and how could we look at this thing, all right? It's a band or a wrap, all right? So that speaks to the form of it. We could be ambiguous about it, just call it a device or call it technology. We could call it a wearable. But then we can modify these ideas with benefits. It provides relief. It's therapeutic. We can add an indication to this, that it's for neuropathy, or it's for pain, or it's an anti-pain device. So, for instance, is it a relief band? Is it a neuropathy reduction device, and so on? So we've got a Chinese menu approach that we can take here to developing descriptors, and then we can modify it further with some dimension of the product that you see here. And so when I work on these projects, I have an Excel spreadsheet and I list all these things and I start combining them myself, or I use software to do brute force combination for me. Now, the solution that they came up with is actually really interesting. And they developed two descriptors depending on their audience. because consumers of this device are really looking for something different than what physicians would look at if they recommend this for their patients. So for consumers, it's a little small here, but it says Quell Wearable Pain Relief Technology. Okay, long but very clear. And so in the first instance, they might give it the full name, Quell Wearable Pain Relief Technology, and after that, they just call it Quell. For doctors, for physicians, it's a wearable intensive nerve stimulation technology, WINS technology, which is a terrific solution. And it also helps position it against the TENS systems that physicians were already familiar with. So, okay, I give away everything I know at operativewords.com. So if you want to learn more about naming, go there, because I want you to all be great namers, or at least great judges of names. So if you have any questions, I'll go ahead and I'll take them now.
So we have microphones, so wait till you get a microphone. We have 2 people passing them out, I believe. Raise your hands, get a mic.
Thanks for sharing your knowledge on this. Really interesting to learn your process. Much appreciated. Sure. I came in a few minutes late, so I'm not sure if you already went over this, but what inspired you to get into this as a career?
Yeah, I'll recap. I hate ugly words, and I don't want to live in a world that's filled with ugly words, and brand names are inescapable now. You know, if any of you have read No Logo by Naomi Klein, great book, brands and commercial merchandising is inescapable. So I figure if we're going to have names foisted on us everywhere we go, they might as well be awesome words. And so just like an architect would rather populate the world with beautiful buildings, I want to do the same with words. So cool. That's what inspired me.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Can you share the name of your permutation software that you use to brute force some of this stuff? And the second question is on your trademark, how tight do you go down in classes to throw out a name or keep a name?
Yeah.
I mean, do you have to be real tight, or is there some flexibility there? And what does Nest trademark, right? Because it's just a regular word.
Yeah. Okay, great question. So on the first one, I actually have to look up the name of that permutation software. It's part of a site that has a bunch of text tools on it, and I can look up that for you after the show. Also, there was an article that came out in January in the New York Times Magazine called The Weird Science of Naming New Products. And I was featured in that article, and that permutation software is mentioned by name there as well. But I can look up for you after the show. Now, on trademarks, I'm going to sound like a lawyer when I say it depends. What you need to really watch out for when you're including classes or not including classes is there likelihood of confusion? So it's helpful to look up the competitors and see what classes they are in, but you also have to be mindful about adjacent categories, adjacent functions that might be somewhat relevant even though it's not really in the core target of a potential trademark. So the answer is really it depends. On the Jaunt project, let me go ahead and see if I can find that here. Yeah, okay, so on Jaunt, we've got hardware and software. That's going to be really core to it, right? But telecommunication services is kind of peripheral, but it's good to know about and to be aware of. So it's always going to depend on what class is the potential conflicting mark in, but really more importantly, what are the goods and services? Now, that's true for the United States. In other countries, if a company has registered a mark in class 9, it almost doesn't matter what the goods and services are. If a company has laid claim to something in class 9, which is broadly scientific apparatus, that can include computer software and sunglasses. All right. So a company in class 9 in some countries will have complete blanket coverage over class 9. In the United States, it really depends on the details of the goods and services description. Nest. How do you own a word like Nest? How do you own a word like Apple? How do you own a word like Caterpillar? Well, it's easy. There's no literal relationship between those words and the product or the company itself, right? So you cannot trademark Apple if you are branding fruit, okay? But you can do it if you're branding something that's not fruit, something that's technology, for instance. So real words, real English words or words in any other language are highly trademarkable so long as they are not confusingly similar to anything else out there, and if there is no literal relationship between the product and the goods and services. So that's how you can trademark a real word like Nest.
I was wondering, do you consult names for things like songs or people, or like other than just products?
You know, part of the screening includes a general Google search, which will tell you about kind of common law usage of marks. And it may also reveal that there's a song that uses this word or other things. But that's not really the focus. And, you know, you don't want to get too caught up necessarily in other things that are out there, because those can prove to be false positives that might cause you to walk away from a name that might otherwise be great. And a great name for one thing could be a great name for another thing. So, you know, you can have Dove, and it's a great name for soap, and it's a great name for chocolate, right? So even though there's other Doves out there, it's totally fine if you're coming up with something that's unrelated to those. Now, the other thing that companies may want to watch out for is appropriateness in other languages, okay? Does this word sound like something inappropriate or obscene in another country, in another language? And the most famous case of this is the Chevy Nova. And the story goes that GM had this car called the Chevy Nova, and they brought it down to Latin America. And as it turns out, Nova is almost nearly just like Nova, which means it doesn't go. So here's the crazy part. Okay, first of all, urban legend. Nova is not Nova. And the Chevy Nova sold awesome in Mexico and Latin America. So the crazy thing about Nova is that GM tested it. They learned that Nova is a lot like Nova, but not quite. And it means it doesn't go. And they looked at that and they said, fuck it, we'll go down to Latin America anyway with the name. And it did really well, right? So what do you do with this? When you look at a word that's spelled identical to an inappropriate thing, or it sounds just like it, and you say, what the hell, I'll go to market with it anyway. You know, how do you evaluate that? How do you judge it? Well, in this particular case, Nova is seen as different from Nova just because they're two words and they're accentuated differently. Also, Mexico already had a petroleum company called Nova there, so that kind of tells you something right there. So anyway, those are some of the other things that you might look out for. You know, if you go to Urban Dictionary and you find a word is used in slang, you kind of got to be careful about that. In other words, you want to be careful about killing a name because its entry shows up in Urban Dictionary. And that's partly because your target audience probably has no idea about that slang usage. It may be very, very limited, and slang comes and goes really quickly. So it's good to be aware of it, but you also want to be judicious on what would trigger killing a name because there's another word out there and it's used in some sort of slang or colloquial way.
Yes, I have a question about you're generating for each name 1,000 of possible combination. And if you can share some tips of how you screen them, because like and are you just going to spend a few seconds for each combination and you just get a feeling, or you do go some other process? Thank you.
So I'm a little unclear on your question. Are you asking about the legal screening process, or how do I select
how
the
do
best
you
names?
select? Yeah, you come out and you have like, sensing cooker. Or why that resonated with you? Do you have a process or just a feeling?
It's kind of both. There's a lot of art and science that goes on with naming. So there's a lot of it is analytic, and you really want to think through to find the right answer. And that's true for both developing descriptors as well as brand names. Okay, but there's also intuition that can play a role. And the thing is that if you get really analytic and you start pulling apart and pressure testing potential brand names, you're going to find you walk away from really wonderful creative names. And that's because consumers do not negatively deconstruct names when they see them on the shelf, right? They always see the positive in a name. Okay, as an example, you can go to a 7-Eleven and you can find Dirty potato chips on the shelf, all right? Now, if I was to present that name, Dirty potato chips, to a client, they'd be looking at me like I was crazy. And yet we accept Dirty potato chips when we see it on the shelf. It makes us lean in and want to learn more because we know companies choose names for positive reasons. And yet when we're evaluating names, it's in our nature and it makes sense to kind of pressure test the name. So you don't want to overthink these things. Flickr, not a good indicator of image quality. And yet Flickr.com is a huge photo sharing site. If you go to the Gap and they're missing your size, you probably don't even think, oh, no wonder they call this place the Gap, right? Even though it's right there staring at you in the face. All right. I call this the positivity principle. And it reflects how people assume the best in a name because they know companies choose names for positive reasons. And people will seek in their own mind to figure out what that positive connection is. Now you might think, gosh, that creates a barrier to understanding, but it doesn't. What it does is it compels an engagement from your audience to that brand name. And when people make that connection of the word to why that word, people feel rewarded when they do that. So you don't want to overthink these things. When I go through and I look at descriptors, I do think through those very, very carefully because I want them to make sense. Because the role of a descriptor is to help explain something, right? To indicate how it's different. The role of a brand name is a little bit different. The role of a brand name is to grab people by the throat. The role of a brand name is to be kind of a springboard for other creative that company needs to develop for their communications. The role of a brand name is to be the handle, the pointer to things. So it has a different role. So there's a lot of intuition that happens. And sometimes I can't really explain why a name works well. So I was lucky enough to work on a project for Qualcomm to help name a chipset for them. And the name that they went with is Snapdragon. You might be familiar with that. So it's remarkably difficult to take a name like Snapdragon, which is completely left field, that has no direct literal relationship to the product, and convince a room full of very logical-minded engineers that this is the name that they should go with. I just looked at it and I was like, this is an awesome name, and I don't know why. Now, I've thought about it, and Snapdragon works really well because it's a collision of two opposing ideas, two different feelings. You've got Snap, which is fast and easy and quick, and then you have Dragon, which is like wild and mythical and fantastical. And you have these two oppositional ideas brought together, and those ideas, by the way, the fast, the easy, the quick, and the wild, the imaginative, the creative, those actually tied into things related to the product, the chipset, and what you could do with it as a developer. So there's a role for analytics, and there's a role for intuition in your selection of names. Yeah.
Do you ever do post-mortem on names? And in doing so, did you find natural traps or recurring traps?
Can you repeat the beginning of your question?
Do you ever do post-mortem on names? And then by doing so, did you find traps or recurring traps to avoid?
So after a name has been selected and launched, do I go back and say, what worked and what works and what doesn't work with the name?
Well, more like was it successful or not? So maybe a little bit after it's deployed.
Yeah. I don't do any post-mortem, and it's nonstop. I mean, kind of depending on how you look at it, I can't help but look at names and wonder, if they're doing well, what are people saying about it, and so on. So I don't have a formal process of a post-mortem, but, I'm always glad, like when my clients, none of my clients have ever been gotten a cease and desist for their name. They never had to retract a name or anything like that. So what I do love to see is when clients take a name and they run with it, and that the name inspires them. So I'll give you an example of that. There was an architecture firm that used to be called Pollock Architecture in San Francisco, and Mr. Pollock was leaving, so they needed a new name. So the name that I developed for them is Rapt Studio, R-A-P-T, Rapt Studio. So they love the name because it speaks to sort of being captivated by something and being surrounded by something, right? And then you have the sound wrapped, which sounds like you are literally wrapped in something. So it works on a lot of dimensions. Well, what the client did was they ended up calling all of their employees Raptors, okay? Yeah. On Monday, they have a company meeting. They call it Rapture Mondays, okay? So I love, oh yeah. And then they have this neon sign that they commissioned that says RAWR, R-A-W-R, sort of in their lobby, I think taking this Raptor idea. So when I look at that and I do a little mental postmortem on it, I get really excited because the name inspired them to do something with it. That inspired creativity in them, and I love that. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very nice presentation.
Thanks.
I have a two-part question. The first one is, the logos have very important role along with the name. And some companies like Google, the name and the logo are one and the same. For Apple, it's not. So can you comment on the process of creating good logos and how they match with the brand name? That's the first part. The second part is following up on what he said. Looking back, can you give us some good examples in your mind of the brand names and the logos that worked very well and the ones that clearly flopped? Like in my mind, Lucent, the logo and the name completely went away from the telephony industry, AT&T. So can you give some examples?
Sure. So regarding your first question, there are different reasons that a company might choose to have a word mark like Google, Nest, or IBM versus having a symbol like Apple does, okay? For one, if your name is the logo, then that enables you to get many more impressions of the name. There may be issues regarding space. So if you believe that your name is going to have to be rendered in a very small space, it may be a benefit to have a symbol that can be reduced to a small size, and that can stand in place of a name. So those are some things to consider when you're looking at developing a word mark or a name, a word plus a symbol, okay? Now regarding what are good examples of those, of identities and names, I don't know. Let me see if there's, okay. So I love Yum, okay? It's a name I developed when I was at Landor, and I like the identity as well. They're able to get the word really large. It speaks to, people saying yum. And it's actually a B2B company. This is a PepsiCo's restaurant spin-off business that owns Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, KFC. So I like it. And right next to it is Panorama. So I created the name Panorama, but it's for grass-fed meats. You can get them at Whole Foods. But I gotta be honest with you, I'm not really crazy about the identity of Panorama because it also uses a speech bubble. But I don't understand why the word panorama is in a speech bubble for me. I don't get that. So that's an example of something that I don't think works as well. You've got FedEx in the middle. I named a line of business there, Custom Critical, which deals with shipping very dangerous things or very pricey things or getting 20 jet engines from Detroit to LA overnight. They do crazy stuff. The FedEx identity is brilliant and amazing. It's a beautiful word mark, and some of you might not know that in between the E and the X, there's an arrow pointed rightward in the white space. So, yeah, see? Yeah. There's someone who's new to that. And now you'll never miss it, right? So it's brilliant. And actually, interesting story about that. That's also developed at Landor. The outside of the letters are by and large from one typeface. But the counters, the white space, actually comes from another font that they brought in there. So it's all very custom and beautiful. I like Avaya too. So Avaya up here, this is a name that I helped develop at Landor. I love how they took and really exploited the inherent nature of the letter forms. Now, I'm a linguist, and I also used to be a typesetter, right? So I'm a little bit obsessed with fonts. And when I came up with Avaya, I actually wrote it down exactly like this, but without the cross strokes there, just because I saw A-V-A-Y-A, it had this beautiful flow and symmetry to it. So I like the Avaya mark, and I like how they've taken the inherent nature and beauty of the relationship between A-V-A-Y-A and built that into the word mark. So I'm pretty keen on that.
So here's one.
Yeah, Don. Yeah, what? Come here. Yeah, I'm coming. Right. If you don't have anything nice to say, but I'll say something anyway. Okay, so what is that? I don't know, and you might not either, or probably don't either. So look, the name of a place should help you find it, right? There should be some sense. This has a function, and it's wayfinding. It's an indicator of a place, but this doesn't tell me anything at all. And this doesn't tell me. What? Oh, is that where we are? Yeah. Okay, this, don't know what that is either. And then this is, I really hope none of you designed this, but this is so cliche. The swoops, the swirls, it's a cliche. It is just unbecoming, especially because you guys are doing design here, and this is not becoming a school of design. So I'm not a fan. Yeah.
I had a lot of questions, but I will stay on two. So one is, going to your brand naming process, going back, so you said a lot, and a lot of tips as well, so I'm not going to. I still would like to understand how you do interact with the designers, but it's a side question. So did you ever consider or done to involve final customer, consumers, or users into the process? Mm-hmm. And if yes, how? And what's your feeling with that? Yeah, I have mine, but it's especially for name creation. And the second point is, have you ever? Some times ago, I went into something about linguistics and an aspect of naming products, so tangible things with respect to the intangible things. That is mainly services, so FedEx is one example. So while you try to name something that is not tangible, you have probably a higher complexity especially into the definition of what the descriptor probably would be, mm-hmm. And due to the lack of iconicity, what we say is, probably the naming has a different. You probably adopt different principles. I don't know. It's just a question.
Yeah, interesting question. I better think of an answer. So let's see. Okay, process and let's put it down. So process. Generally, what happens is, after the client does their full legal screening of names, at that point, the client adopts one final name, and that is when design begins. There are occasions when a design might already be in place, like, we don't want to change our look and feel system. Can we have a name that drops into this system? That's a possibility that sometimes happens. But usually the designers get involved at the end so that they have one design to design to. Now, there are cases where a company is willing to pay more and commission, to have, all right, top 3 names, top 3 designs. a notable exception, I led the renaming of Anderson Consulting to Accenture. And on that project, there were over 50 candidate names that were simultaneously being researched, but also being designed to. And so it was incredible where there were 53 names and 53 identities. And all the permutations, they were done in parallel because the timing was totally insane and they had to be done in parallel. So that's kind of an exception to that. Now, on your other question regarding, consumers and research and that kind of thing, well, you got to be really careful with how you research brand names because it seems very intuitive, and Don was talking about kind of the counterintuitiveness of naming. You'd think you should ask people what name they like, but no, you shouldn't, because what people like is what they're familiar with. And so what you get when you research and ask people what name do you like is what you're really learning is how familiar is this to you. So you never ask what do you like. It's more about which of these names. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So I did naming for Samsung and I named a bunch of their mobile phones. And one of them, they wanted to be perceived as very stylish. Okay, so there were 5 candidate names and the research questions were, these are 5 nightclubs in New York. Which of these is the most popular or which is the most stylish? And so when you put the name in a different category, you're not limiting people's thinking to a specific category. Nightclub has the same kind of intrinsic values of coolness that you might aspire to. So whatever nightclub is perceived as the coolest, and by virtue of the name, they got nothing else to go on, then you also know which name is going to be able to best deliver on that sense of coolness. Finally, on naming abstract things versus actual products, it kind of depends. There's no hard and fast answer. So I look here and there's products and things I've named. The Milo communicator for Sony. There's Photoshop Lightroom for Adobe. There's phones. But then you've got other things like a renewable energy company called Pattern, or a company that offers urban hunts and team building exercises called Run Brain Run. So I think it just depends on the project, and there isn't any one, like services are named this way, products, hardware, software, whatever are named a different way. So I can't really say that there's one definitive answer to that.
So we'll take 2 more questions and the microphones are out.
Yeah.
I have a very straightforward question. How long does it take for the whole process from getting the contract from the company and delivering the name and the final name? And a second question, more personal question for you is, how long does it take for you to get the whole list that you're presenting?
Yeah.
Like in terms of actual hours that you spend without counting the incubation, or like days?
Okay, so the whole process takes about 6 weeks, and that's pretty typical. The client might take a couple extra weeks for their screening, so it's a few days up front for briefing and objectives, and then 2 weeks for creative development, and then about 3 days for knockout screening and building a deck. Okay, and then I repeat that creative process again, so it's 2 weeks times 2. Okay, now during those 2 weeks, I am working on that project, and I'm probably working on other projects. I work on 1 or 2 projects for a day, then I work on different projects for another day. How many hours? I actually don't have the foggiest idea how many hours I actually put into it. And I don't know if I want to know that. I may find I'm working for less than minimum wage, because I never, ever, ever turn it off. It's kind of a compulsion for me once I'm in the creative development phase. So that's basically how long. Did that answer all your questions? Okay, yeah, questions, yeah. All
Thank you for sharing all your ideas with us.
Sure. Thanks.
So some names that may fit perfectly today may not fit as perfectly in 10 years from now. So I'm wondering how you go about taking the fact that names might become outdated when you're
Yeah,
going through this
that's a
process.
really good question. So that's most likely to happen with technology because technology changes a lot and clients get very excited about their technology, but client's technology evolves. And so you want to be really careful about putting anything specific related to specific technology into a name. There was a time when, Radio Shack might have made sense as an example, but if you have a music site to pin that on a specific format like MP3, or AAC or whatever, any specific technology reference in a name is generally a bad idea because that's going to become outdated. Also, I want names to last, so I'm not really looking at slang or how things are used in vernacular, if it's specific to a subgroup or it's jargon or anything like that, which can be a challenge. So if I work on a project which is for adolescents, say, I really don't want to know much about their slang. I will want to know how they talk generally and their language, but I will not want to adopt, their in language, their in words as something for a name because language changes constantly and more so for younger folk. So,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks for asking.
Thank you very much.
Okay.